got to the. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rohan, and welcome to today's guest speaker event on careers in tech law, brought to you by the South Asian Law Students Association. SALSA is dedicated to the advancement and visibility of the South Asian community, both here in the law school and the Maxwell School of Citizenship. Through dialogue, we strive to enrich the discourse on South Asia-related issues within our communities. Today, we are honored to have with us a distinguished lawyer, Mr. Aneesh Mehta. Mr. Mehta is the product and developer legal lead for Microsoft India, where he leads legal support for India Development Center, which is Microsoft's largest research and development center outside the Redmond headquarters. He has had a distinguished career spanning many years as an IP attorney, product counsel, and senior corporate counsel. Mr. Mehta is also a former president of the South Asian Bar Association of North America, former co-chair of the Intellectual Property Committee of the Philadelphia Bar Association, and serves on the board of directors of many philanthropic organizations. Mr. Mehta has a bachelor's in science and electrical engineering from the University of Florida, a JD from Rutgers Law School in New Jersey, an LLM from Temple University, and a master's in electrical engineering from the University of Florida. Mr. Mehta, it is an honor to have you. We are also privileged to have with us today our very own Professor Shubha Ghosh. Professor Ghosh is the director of Syracuse Intellectual Property Law Institute and Crandall Melvin Professor of Law. Professor Ghosh's research focuses on the development and commercialization of intellectual property and technology as a means of promoting economic and social development. He has published extensively on pharmaceutical, design, copyright protection of standards, competition policy, and other intellectual property issues. Professor Ghosh taught at the University of Wisconsin Law School as a chair and tenured professor. He earned his JD from Stanford University and PhD in economics from the University of Michigan. Professor Ghosh, it is great to have you with us here today, despite your time constraints and travel. Today's event will have three parts. First, Professor Ghosh will start off the conversation with Mr. Mehta, focusing on potential careers within the rapidly developing tech landscape. Second, we will have questions from our student panel consisting of SALSA members. Finally, the floor will be open to questions from the audience. Please remember to fill in the sign-in sheet at the back of the class and treat yourself to some food. I'm very thankful to LexisNexis for sponsoring the food for this event, and especially Mikey for coordinating and making this a reality. I'm thankful to SALSA leaders Anushi, Anchal, Akshata, Ahmed, and Sai for the relentless efforts in making this event a reality. Without further ado, I will now hand it over to Professor Ghosh to begin the conversations.
Thank you, Rohan. Thanks to you and all the SALSA members for making this possible. I hope to see many more events like this. And thank you, Mr. Mehta, for taking the time to speak with us. Look forward to having a good conversation, roughly in the next 20 minutes or so. Mr. Mehta, one question that's always of interest to law students, I think, is something that to make everything more concrete. Describe your day as an attorney with Microsoft. Highlights, low points, everything.
I mean, the nice thing is that I enjoy is I don't have a standard day. It really is my role out here now is very much a generalist role. So there can be a mix of some government affairs work. There can be a mix of kind of policy work internally. There could be a mix of contract review, and then I then just kind of sometimes just sit and try to learn what's going on. As I think we've all been watching the news articles. Quite a bit's going on in AI. Like it's an exciting time, but I think you don't always know whenever a new technology comes to surface how it's going to manifest, how the product teams are going to react to it, how customers or regulators are going to react to it. So I have to set aside quite a bit of time to just kind of try to learn as much that's going on here as possible and make sure that I've got the right people connected, right people kind of hearing what's going on and being able to advise back.
Yeah. So One thing that'll be helpful too is you split your time, I think, between countries as well as between fields or among fields, really. So as far as between countries, how much time do you spend in India? How much time do you spend in the United States? How much time do you spend in other countries? I think the international aspect is something that interests all our students. And I think especially some of our SALSA members might be interested in the South Asia US bridge that you provide.
The question. So I've actually moved out to India. I live in Hyderabad now.
Oh, okay. Okay. I didn't know
yeah.
that.
I report, my manager's still in Redmond, so I report back into Corp. But they had asked me to come out here. They had not had a product counsel doing like the role that I'm doing now. And so they kind of asked me to come out here and start that up. And so, yeah, it's been about 7 months now, 7.5 months we've been out here. And I grew up in Florida. I was born and raised in the US. So this is a first time living in India for me. And it's been quite a wonderful experience so far.
Oh, interesting. So how big is your team in Hyderabad?
So it's just me in Hyderabad. So there's
you right now, okay?
Several thousand engineers. And so I'm supporting there's dev centers in Hyderabad, there's Bangalore, and in Delhi. So I have one other person working on my team, and then I have to coordinate with all the attorneys in the US who had historically been supporting the team and kind of figure out what the best way to do this is.
Yeah, so that's interesting. And so you're supervising a team of engineers and product development, and you mentioned something about working with legislation. I mean, how much work do you do with Delhi? I mean, are you doing things with the monitoring the landscape in India in terms of developments with respect to AI and technology law?
So we're fortunate to have a very good government affairs team that actually that's their role day in, day out. So I stay in touch with them, pretty regularly to kind of understand what's going on when kind of laws are coming down, regulations are coming down. I'm very much learning the parliamentary system in India and how in the US we know the bill becomes a law commercial, but here it's a little bit different. The timelines are a little bit different. The terminology is different, right? So when you hear something, they don't say necessarily it's going to be in June of this. They'll say, well, it's the monsoon session or it's the winter session. And so understanding what happens and what some of the drivers are around when the announcements are made has been a fascinating experience. And then, of course, G20 is happening in India with them at the host, and that's also generating a lot of interest in India, which also now has created an opportunity for India, I think, to lead in some areas. And so there's no shortage of activity that the government affairs team is involved in.
Yeah, fascinating. I mean, do you have any? I know I've only been there a short period of time. Do you have any compare and contrast stories in terms of how it's like to deal with Indian legislature versus the US legislature? I mean, is there much more national legislation there? Are things more at the state level in the US, or what is your feeling about that?
Yeah, I mean, the sense I get here is that there's a lot of policy, particularly around the tech area, that is being driven by the national government more so than the US, right? I mean, I think US, we still have this kind of patchwork kind of setup of privacy laws and security laws, and there's hanging around. I think obviously Europe led everything with GDPR. I think India is kind of closer to that model from what I've seen. There is a data protection bill that is a draft has been introduced. Now it's kind of understanding when is that going to actually be enacted in law, and then there's kind of a follow on with the various bureaucracies, the various departments then implement the actual rules that follow on to that. And so understanding that pipeline is something I'm trying to spend a good amount of time doing, because it's very much different than what the US would do.
Yeah. And so let's shift maybe a little bit. I mean, I'm fascinated to explore this about the comparisons, but it might be interesting also to talk about your bridging two other worlds, and that is the tech world as an engineer, and then also the legal world. How are you finding that? What types of perspective can you provide on that?
Well, I mean, I can safely say I'm a failed engineer, right? I grew up wanting to be an engineer. My dad's an engineer. His dad was an engineer. And I think early on, I knew I was interested in tech, although, the folks in the room are quite a bit younger. So I just like gadgets. I grew up watching, Inspector Gadget, watching James Bond movies. I always was interested in hardware, and so I pursued that route. I think in practice, I didn't realize the day-to-day involved so much debugging, and I think I realized like it wasn't. I still wanted to be around technology. I didn't necessarily at the time enjoy the debugging aspect. I went back. I left an engineering job, went to graduate school to kind of explore different areas of electrical, and then it was then that I thought that maybe it was time to try a different route to work with technology.
Yeah.
So, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was about to say, I mean, one of the things you talked about, you like gadgets, and then you talked about debugging. You want to talk a little bit about the hardware software interface, both I hate to call you a failed engineer. I mean, I think there's some people who think about law as a type of social engineering, or there's a phrase transaction cost engineering. So there, a lot of the skills carry over. But you want to talk a little bit about the hardware software? Is that something that comes up? Because that's particularly interesting with AI, right? Because we often think about AI in terms of these little robots and hardware, but a lot of it is just software driven, right? Or any thoughts about that?
I think the common thing, a few years back, they started saying software will eat the world, and now it's AI will eat software, right? I mean, there's in the IP sense, it's super fascinating, right? Like, I mean, it's in some ways, they're calling it generative AI. Obviously, it's based on large models of data, but it kind of is coming up with new things, right? And it's in terms of what drives it, there's very powerful hardware, particularly in the cloud side. There's mega wattage of computing power, but then there's also these fascinating software models, and it's always sort of fit in between IP regimes, right? If we look at something like an AI model, it's an algorithm, right? Like, not typically protectable by a patent space. Is it a copyright issue? Like, I don't know. Then the question is, what is the output? Like, and who's created the output? And I know the USPTO has put out a new circular, but I think there's still TBD on, like, how do we deal with all the IP issues around it? Because it is mostly software now at this point, right? In terms of what the innovation is. Yeah, and I view this from a very U.S. centric IP view, but I think you'll see is different countries are going to come at this very differently.
I think India has had a position about whether a non-human can own intellectual property, right? I mean, obviously the USPTO or the Patent Office has its decisions, and the USPTO has a decision. Where's India on this?
You know what? I have not actually looked into where India sits on this. That's actually a good question. I think for us, for me, my role particularly, I'm worried more about the regulatory side. But I haven't looked into where the IP is. That's actually a good question that I should look into.
Yeah, I thought there was some legislation that, again, a lot of this is sort of subject to interpretation and debate, that really limited the ability of non-humans to own, at least copyright and possibly patents under the Indian regime. But there are other regimes like South Africa that have embraced it, and Australia seems to have embraced it. So it's interesting to see whether there'll be a global norm or not. So, but when you're saying the regulatory side, we've heard a lot about ChatGPT, and I think without giving any secrets, we know ChatGPT may be integrated into Bing and search engines there, and Microsoft. Is that your big focus right now in terms of the regulatory side, or is crypto, and is that something that also that you're involved with, the currency side?
So I personally am not involved in any of the currency side. I think for us, like, there's the large language model like ChatGPT, but then overall AI just in general now has created a buzz. I think this is right now its moment, and so I think for a while we've had teams that are super focused on the ethics side, right? Like, I think whenever you have a new technology, you're always going to be too far ahead out of where the laws are, right? You've leapfrogged where the legislative session is. It wasn't right for them. It's getting to the point where it's right for regulators to kind of start addressing the questions that are asked. And a lot of them are ethical, like the right way, because again, these models don't, it's not something that's a self-aware model. It's something that's trained on data that has been provided to it. And there are very real outcomes to having an AI driven software make any type of decision, right? Whether it's to draft you your resume letter or to, decide to sell 10 widgets or 2 widgets. And so understanding like how these systems are biased, what that means, what the outcomes are, what the societal outcomes are. I think this is something that regulators are starting to dig into, and that we have to have good answers for the regulators, and we have to have good guidance for our clients to follow that the right way.
Yeah. One last tech question, then we can talk a bit more about the law side in terms of the background and what you're working on. And you've touched on that a little bit. So how do you think ChatGPT will affect search? Will it mostly be on the output side? I mean, I think we imagine now that instead of getting a list of hits, we're going to get a nice little search report from ChatGPT. And so how do you think it's going to affect search?
I mean, I think the interesting thing is you never know what the consumer segment wants, right? I mean, if we look at chat, we've had an era where there's the traditional Google, Yahoo search engine kind of model has been like the dominant model. I think right before that there was something called Ask Jeeves that was around. That was essentially this, right? Not with a little less tech behind it, but still the same idea that you would be provided an answer to your question as opposed to served up, a list of websites. I think time will tell if that's what people want. I mean,
Yep.
this is like the consumer segment is notoriously difficult to figure out, and who could have predicted, like if we look at like the social media realm, like who could have predicted that TikTok, the video thing, would be this big when maybe like 10 years ago or maybe less, 7 years ago there was Vine, which Twitter bought, and I think they shut down. So I think it's very hard to tell. I think it brings a lot of promise. I think the idea of getting an answer to me is actually quite fascinating as opposed to the links. But then the devil's in the details of like, one is that experience what people expect, and two, does it meet the bar of what they want, and three, I guess is it a viable business?
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned Ask Jeeves. I guess Ask Jeeves was in the popular culture last year a little bit with Better Call Saul. I don't know if you watched that. Anyway, did
it come back in Better Call Saul?
No spoiler alert. It did come back as kind of a funny reference in Better Call Saul in the last couple of episodes. But in any case, I never used Ask Jeeves. I think I immediately went into some of the other search engines. It didn't last too long. But it's interesting that you brought that up now. So in some ways, it's funny that you reference Ask Jeeves, because in some ways, attorneys are like Jeeves, right? They're asked to go out and find answers to questions. And so how do you find your training as an attorney and your practice experience as an attorney? Because you were with a law firm for some time, weren't you, if I remember
Yes.
correctly?
Yeah.
How did that, in terms of the skill set, and then also in terms of the career transitions, how does that fit together for you?
I mean, I think there's very little like comparable experience to the law firm experience, right? I think as folks are looking at trying to decide what they want to do when they come out of school, like here's the stark difference. In-house, you're called a cost center, right? Like I cost money. There's money that they can't spend on engineering because they're spending it on us, working with the engineers. At a law firm, you're a profit center, right? Like you are their product. And so there's a little bit of difference in sort of how they view your training, how they view like who like the resources go into. And so I think, you have the luxury of having all these partners and senior associates or whatever at the law firms who are there to train you to make you more profitable for the firm. I think, companies are not typically staffed that way, that you have this large ecosystem. It's certainly a collegial place I work at. I certainly have a lot of people and mentors. But it wasn't a place where somebody's going to be reviewing my drafts. And so like there's a large level of autonomy out here in corporate life. At the law firm, it was 3 people wanted to review every document before it went out to the client. And you learn different styles, and you learn different styles of clients, and it helps you get ready for a role where you have a little bit more independence.
Yeah. And how did you make that transition? I mean, what types of advice would you give? Were you planning this, or I assume if the answer typically is it's serendipitous, but how did your your career trajectory work out for you?
Yeah, I've been fortunate that I did not plan any of this. I think I've been lucky to be kind of in with the right crowd, and have a good set of friends who've actually come to me and said, hey, maybe you should think about trying X, Y, or Z. And in the particular case of Microsoft, I was happy with my firm. I was, had been there for 8 years. And a friend who I knew from the Philly Bar Association reached out and said, I moved to Seattle. My husband works at Microsoft in the engineering department for, one of the office products. There's some jobs out there in the patent group. I think you'd like it. And that sort of kicked off a conversation with my wife. Where do you want to live? And then I kind of looked into the job next, and I hadn't thought of in-house life. But I always sort of what I always had done is sort of chased a technology or something of interest, right? And at the time, as ubiquitous as the word cloud is now, me being even like in an IP firm, didn't really understand what they meant when they went cloud, outside of cloud storage and some other kind of minor use cases. To me, I was thinking, this is just remote computing, right? This is how it started. Like, this is like, not too long before I went to college, I started doing. So the idea that they were investing in something, and a lot of people were investing in something that I didn't understand, kind of intrigued me to learn more. The job was for a patent attorney role for the Azure team. And so I went ahead and interviewed, and they looped me and then eventually hired me.
And were you hired with thought of that you would be on the India side of things, or did that just happen? Yeah, that just happened. How long were you in Microsoft before you made the? How long were you in I assume you were out in Redmond before moving out to Hyderabad.
7.5 years or so in Redmond. Yeah. So this is my 4th role in Redmond.
Wow.
Yeah. It's been a nice thing. And again, each one of these moves has sort of, again, been sort of having conversations with people and them thinking of me at the right time, saying like, you should probably look into this. It might interest you.
And was each of those roles as an attorney primarily, or was it sort of a hybrid attorney, tech advisor, business consultant? How would you describe it?
So I started in the patent group, and I did portfolio manager was called for several of the groups in Azure. And then I decided I wanted to try something completely different, and I became the attorney for the global supply chain, which is way out of my scope of experience. And then I decided I kind of wanted to be able to go back and be a little bit closer to engineering, and so I started picking up support for hardware products, and so I was the attorney for several of our Surface products, and then I was attorney for Xbox hardware. Oh, wow. And that was the last role I took before I took this role and moved out to India.
Yeah, so fascinating. How long do you plan to be in India? Do you know, is there a long-term, short-term? Is it just pretty much, are you settling in, or are you sort of there to set up shop and then expand, or what's, I mean, without giving away any secrets, of course, but just.
Yeah, I mean, I have my OCI card, so I can stay out, I guess, as long as I want. I think, when I took the role, I had never visited Hyderabad. I knew nothing about it. I didn't know any of the clients out here. And so, I told him, I'm interested in, trying it out for a couple of years and seeing how I feel and seeing how you guys feel about what I'm doing. And then let's see. I think for me, again, like, I always chase like some type of challenge. Like, I want there to be something for me to do. And it's not like I left every role and everything was 100% solved, but it's like, I feel like I want to have, some area that I think I can add like extra value to. And so I think as long as I feel I can do that, I'll try to stay in this role. And if I feel like there's some other place that I think I want to try that would be challenging for me, that I think I could add value, then I'll talk to my leadership and see what to do next.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's great. You've got so many roles, so many different trajectories that you really have a lot of value and a lot of information for our students. Rohan, did you want me to transition to the next stage now, or we can talk a little bit more, but it's up to you.
You can talk about it a bit more. We also have questions. Anything is fine, but we are having a fascinating conversation here. We are enjoying.
Yes. So one of the questions I have for you, I guess it's two-part. One you can ask directly, one you can answer maybe more indirectly, and that is, how do you find your engineering background and your tech background meshing with law school? Was law school as daunting as moving to Hyderabad, but given that background, or did you find that transition, kind of well planned out? And what advice would you give to students who don't necessarily have a tech background, but are very interested in the kind of work you're doing?
So for the engineering background in law school, I think the first semester of law school was like a complete shock going to the exams. Like the idea of kind of subjective exams like blew my mind. Like I wasn't quite aware of like what the style was. I think the course that resonated me with most was seemingly the one that people liked the least, and that was Civ Pro. I loved Civ Pro.
Yep.
No rules. It was all a formula to me. I could just visualize it. There was other ones like tort law that I was like, oh man, like this is a winding loop, right? Like how do I figure out where this is going to go? And so like it took a while. Then I think the second semester it kind of calmed down, and then I got in like a good flow after that. But the total difference was a bit of a shock. I think in terms of like with comparison with the move to India. So for law school, I moved to New Jersey, and that was a shock in itself too. And moving out here, that's also been quite a bit of an interesting thing. I had visited India like growing up. I visited, but then I hadn't visited since I think 2015. I came out here, and then I didn't visit again until 2022. And so India has changed so dramatically, even through COVID, the way things have accelerated. I was not prepared for what it's like out here. It's fascinating, the areas that are so much easier. Like I can get on my phone right now and ask for a food delivery, and somebody will be here in 10 minutes, like groceries. I could and on the other hand, like getting life set up here was a little bit more complex than I would have thought. Just getting the gas turned on, doing minor things that I didn't realize, like the levels of documentation you need. But I think both have been wonderful journeys, and I would do them each again if I had the choice.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So there's a question I was going to ask you about. You mentioned the first year and the legal thinking compared to the engineering thinking or the tech thinking. Right now, though, I mean, you talked about having to deal with ethics issues and so forth. So are you finding that some of the more qualitative aspects of law school coming back to somehow help you, especially when you're trying to address some of the ethics or policy issues that come up? Or do you find that, well, I can try to reduce everything to some sort of a formula, or obviously it's not that simple, but how do you find the qualitative and quantitative mix in terms of your work and your thinking and your interaction with colleagues?
No, so there's definitely like the two sides. I mean, like you have to take the both approaches, right? Like if for lack of a better way to put it, the liberal arts side approach versus like the engineering approach. And I think of like, the simple scenario I can give you is a few years back, like when I first started working with clients who did AI, I was doing a lot of agreements and trying to figure out how to do like the IP, like think about how do I think about the IP in there. And I was using all the language that you would use in AI, right? Like the training data, weights, all this kind of stuff. And then like at some point, like I just felt like I didn't know what I was talking about, right? Like if you say a word enough times, it loses meaning. And so then I actually came back and sat down with one of the engineers who's like just absolutely brilliant at AI. And I said, look, I really don't know like what you mean when you say this, right? Like I understand it conceptually, but like, what are you giving to other people? Is it a file? Can I see the file? Like what's in there? Can I read it? Like, how do I understand? So like I actually sat down, I spent like, a month or two trying to learn like really basic Python so I could do just one sort of like learning module in AI. So I can sit down. And so like, I realized that like, I needed both sides, right? Like just because, contract law is an imperfect way, right? We use the English language to describe all kinds of concepts. And then without actually sitting down and trying to do the experiment and kind of understand just the base level of what they're doing, like I could get by. I think if the contracts made sense to them, but when I thought back a little bit more, it didn't make sense to me. And so like, I I have to blend both sides, or else it doesn't make sense to me at some point.
Yeah, interesting. So Rohan says we have some questions in the room. Why don't we turn? So it was a pleasure talking with you, Aneesh. Hopefully
Yeah.
we can revert back in a few minutes as well. But let's hear from the audience.
Thank you very much, Professor. What a fascinating conversation. So I had a couple of questions, and one of the questions I had is for Aneesh is, how do you sort of, with a US JD, end up with an international career working abroad? I think this is a question which many of us in the salsa community have over here.
Well, I guess if one thing is it's seemingly going to be a lot easier as the Indian legal market seems to be liberalized in the announcement this week.
Yeah.
I mean, this is purely a function of me working at a large multinational. Now, that's not to say I didn't do work when I was a patent attorney. We would file all over the world. I was involved in licensing and litigation, and so I would travel every now and again for litigation purposes. And I think I had like maybe 2 international trips. But this is purely like, it's a large company, right? But it's a US based company, and the value I bring right now is not an expertise in Indian law. If we go into Indian court, we're clearly going to hire an outside counsel. But it's more being able to align like the internal policies of how we operate here with what we do in Redmond, and help the teams calibrate it, right? Like, I mean, I think as the folks here see regulations coming out of India and Europe and, US, everywhere else, in Redmond, you always had people who were there to kind of filter all that out and help the engineering teams figure out how that to operationalize the guidance and actually, make their product. I think that's what I'm here to do. So it's very much a sense of like, helping filter out all of like the kind of waiver regulations into internal policy to help them work. And so the US JD matters, but similarly, there's people with working at Redmond who have JDs from India, or LLB in many cases, from Australia, from Japan, from all over the world. So it's a mix of that. There's folks who've gone over from India to there, and folks who've gone over from there to here.
Mm-hmm. Okay. My second question was, so if you were a law student today, how would you do things differently? And how do you deal with imposter syndrome? Does it get better?
How would I do differently than what I did in law school when I went through?
Yes, like your foremost advices for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best advice I got was like the advice I got, like, I think it was like day 1 or day 2 of orientation. And they said basically your professional reputation starts today. So no matter what you do, no matter what you like, or how you want to end up, it's all going to be dependent on your reputation. Like nothing else matters in much of the law as your reputation. You can lose a case, you can mess up a contract, you can have typos, but you can come back from all of those, right? You can get a bad grade in a class, you can come back from that. Like these are not gamers. You can get fired from a job for whatever reason, come back. But if your reputation is damaged, it's very hard to come back from. And so I think you should make sure you protect it. Like the people in the room, the people in your class, those people are going to follow you around your career in some sense. They're going to be your friends, they're going to be your peers, they're going to be your opposing counsel, they're going to be your co-counsel, they're going to be the judge. And so, focus on your reputation always, above all. Like, and if you do that, you're going to end up in a good place. I think the other thing is, in terms of thinking of what you want to do for your career, I'd say follow your, people say follow your passion, and I find that a hard advice to follow. Like, even let's say I enjoy video games. Do I have a passion for video games? I don't know what I would call that. I got to work with video games. That was incredible, right? But like working in an area that I enjoy is not the same thing as playing video games. It's not the same thing as my passion. I say follow your curiosity, right? I think as long as you're following something that you're interested in continuing to learn and iterate on, again, I think you'll end up okay. I think that's not to say that money doesn't matter. Like it's not to say that you don't want to discharge your student loans, but like, hopefully you can find something that like can always keep you curious and wanting to learn. And I think for me, at the moment where I'm not curious about something, or I'm a little less interested, that's when I think that's when I think it might be time for a change. And then your manager matters. So if you have a choice when you're looking for jobs, and you can pick between prestigious name, money, anything, and a great manager, take a great manager every time. Because I think that the accelerant that like a great manager can do for your career far outweighs almost anything else.
Yeah, not to take the reins back, Rohan, but I thought I'd follow up with that question a little bit, since first of all, I don't like the phrase imposter syndrome, but I can send you an article from the New Yorker recently that takes that concept apart. I think that's overused, but just do your work, enjoy your work, be honest with yourself about that, and don't worry about whether you're whatever that might mean. Anyway, that's another lecture, sorry, or another. What I thought I would do, since I'm the only law professor in the room, and de facto I'm representing the law school, so I'll take the hit, Aneesh, and I'll ask you this question. What would you say to law schools that they could do better? Either, I won't take it personally, of course, but individual law professors, law deans, this isn't you shouldn't take this as an opportunity to rant about your law school or anything, but generally in terms of legal education, in terms of training students, or providing this service, what advice would you give from that perspective? Because it's obviously a two-way street. It's not just simply, in terms of what things you could do. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so one is, and particularly, and I don't know if this experience is going to resonate with everybody else. Like, even though my dad was a professor in engineering, like throughout my, education, I was always hesitant to ever walk up and talk to a professor for anything. Like, I didn't go to, office hours. I didn't do any of that stuff. I did my work, I did my reading, and then it kind of kept it separate. I think that's a huge mistake on my part, right? That was a giant miss to not spend time to getting to know my professors. I actually got to know them after law school, and I kind of wish I'd spent time, because I think they could have helped me out and course corrected many times early on in terms of how I would approach things, how I would write, how I would think. And so if I were going to make a suggestion, it's like, make an effort to reach out to people who don't understand the value of office hours. Like, I think it's always offered, and I think people don't realize how important it is, particularly coming from engineering. Like, I wouldn't have a debate with my engineering professor, unless it's debating whether I answered it right or wrong, right? So it wasn't in my norm to go down and sit down and talk about philosophy and understanding. I think the other one is really in the career services side. I think, and I'm not speaking for Syracuse, I think there's often too much focus on OCI, too much focus on like the top 10% of the class. Like, you guys are at a great school. Like, you don't, it's great to be in top 10% of the class. You don't have to be. I believe the president of the United States is an alum of your school who might not have been in the top 10 of your class. But I think figuring out ways to make sure that people understand that there's a path for them and helping them through that. I think that would be a good thing, because I get a call from lots of law students who can be panicked about their job prospects because they didn't get an OCI job.
Yeah. I mean, for whatever it's worth, my perspective is I think there's a sense of being overwhelmed. I don't know if you felt that when you're in law school. Like, there are too many choices. It's like going down I'll give a shout out to our local grocery store. It's like going out in the aisles of Wegmans and just being overwhelmed by all the different peanut butters and all the different cereals and things. Did you have that feeling too, of just being overwhelmed, or you think that's more of a recent phenomenon? Or maybe I'm completely wrong about that.
So also, I just didn't know what, so I mean, even when I went to the firm that I ended up at, they said, what are you going to do? What do you want to do? Patent prosecution or patent litigation? I don't know. Even if with a few choices, I didn't know enough to make an educated selection between those. And so I think that one's the harder one, is how do you help people think about, what choices mean? And I say this knowing that I hear a lot of people talk, successful folks talk about all these choices they had. And yet I know the most worrisome thing is when you have no choices, right? Like, if, I only have this one job offer, I don't have a job offer. Like, every one of us, I'll say that there are times where I always felt like I had no choices, or I was uncertain. So don't it's okay. It's natural. choices will come as you kind of focus on those first couple things, right? Focus on your reputation, focus on your curiosity. Those choices will come, and then like it's okay, you can change, right? Like if like even if you have a lot of choices, like don't over worry about like the opportunity cost of one versus the other. Find that manager, find that training, and if you don't like it, it's just a job. You can find a new one.
Okay, we have a question here from Mikey. We have time for one question and we have to wrap up in 5 minutes. Here you go.
Sure, yeah. Sorry to bring it back to ChatGPT, and I actually asked ChatGPT to help me, refine my questions for you. But considering the widespread applications of AI systems like ChatGPT, including potential uses in practicing law and drug discovery, especially in India, where the pharmaceutical industry is pretty large, how is Microsoft proactively addressing potential legal liabilities in India? Are there any specific policies, partnerships, or legislative efforts in place to ensure compliance with Indian regulations and mitigate risks associated with AI-powered services? Sorry, that's such a loaded question, and you could probably go like hours and hours and on, but I would love to hear your insight on it.
Well, just to be clear, ChatGPT is OpenAI, right? That's a separate company than Microsoft.
Mhm.
Your question was, given the potential uses, which could be used in regulated industries, what is Microsoft doing to head that up?
From my understanding that there is some sort of partnership between Bing AI services using ChatGPT, and I was just curious how liability would work if, say, someone were to use it for uses other than that. Are there any disclosures that Microsoft is working with, especially with like prior news with how rogue Bing's AI system was working?
So, yeah, I mean, I think one is I'll take it back to the general case, right? Like any technology is sort of is good or bad is what the user does, right? Like, I mean, I think in the right hands, any technology can be helpful and one can be negative. So I think you always have to understand that like there are the cases that when a company launches tech, you want people to use, right? You always want it to be helpful. You want it to be able to improve your productivity. And then there's bad actors, right? Like if we take the case of email, right? Like it's to communicate. There's also phishing scams that people do on emails. And so I think, what you have to do before you launch any kind of new technology is really try to workshop through those cases and then realize that you're not going to catch every bad actor before they do something, but you need to have the systems in place to respond quickly, right? And so I think that's really what it's about is sort of with all these new AI technologies as they're being rolled out. I think being able to be agile and respond and do the right thing is important. And so there's we have a large team for responsible responsible AI, and they are constantly advising us and constantly helping us think and pushing us think about how to think ahead. Like you don't want to wait till a regulator jumps in, right? You don't want to wait till like some negative some technology comes out and does something that negatively impacts society. You need to be there to understand the signals early and try to respond to them early.
Okay, I think Ahmed has a question, then we will wrap up.
Hey, thank you very much for your time. So quick question regarding the speed of innovation in product development versus legal protection. So obviously tech is a very fast moving space in general, and the legal space, I'm only a 1L, so I don't know too much, but from what I understand, it's pretty much the opposite of that. And so the rate of product development is way faster than probably legal is able to keep up. How does Microsoft kind of deal with that?
That's what keeps us employed, right? I mean, that's where you really have to have like a framework of sort of how to. It's an ethics framework, right? Like I think with any technology you're going to introduce, you need to have an ethics framework that's gonna be there, that's gonna precede any legal framework, right? Like, and so you have to sit down and kind of think about like what are the societal impacts of any technology you're going to introduce. What is a responsible way to introduce this technology? What's a responsible way to develop the technology? And then there's as fast as it moves, you still like your job sometimes is counsel is to say, slow it down, right? Like we have to sit back and think about this. And so I think it's the bread and butter thing of what we do is counsel, right? Like we're there to ask them to think about it. It's not like, we do some contract work, we do this, but a lot of it is let's sit down and think about this and kind of look around the corners and pressure test what their assumptions are on what like the impact of any technology, whether it be video games, whether it be social media, whether it be Excel, right? Like you have to sit down and think about what are the good and bad use cases. How do we minimize or find ways to cut down the bad use cases, and how do we amplify the good use cases?
Thank you very much, Aneesh. Thank you very much, Professor Ghosh. We have to wrap up now. Thank you so much for your time. We wish you were here in person, but we will definitely stay connected. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very nice to meet everybody. Thank you.